And then came COVID. And very early on, I could see that what we were being told was incoherent, did not accord with anything that I had ever learned about respiratory infections as a doctor, and that the draconian response to it was completely disproportionate to the threat that it posed. The infection fatality rate was said to be much higher than it was. I mean, right from the start, we had figures from Johnny and Edith, Michael Levitt, the data from the Diamond Princess, the big cruise ship, that there was no excess mortality whatsoever. And the infection fatality rate, and at those times, don't forget, there were no tests, but was a fraction of 1%, right from the start. So this was never a highly infectious, contagious, dangerous pandemic. And as I say, there's so much you could say about that. The very definition of the word pandemic had been changed in preparation, I contend, for this event. So yeah, all of that. So then from 2020, I was making videos in my own house about the data, the papers that I was reading. Professor Dolores Cahill was sending me papers from a decade previously looking at mRNA technology and showing that it was unsafe for human use and that it had been shelved essentially as dangerous 10 years previously. And, just it became apparent that the lockdowns and the psychological manipulation of a population for essentially a non-event was there as a pretext for mass vaccination. That was apparent from 2020. I was making these videos, and then on
Just on that point there, you're saying about what it wasn't coherent. What were you seeing that didn't line up for you?
well, I was looking at the real life data. I was looking at the world data. I was looking at Sweden, who chose not to lock down, for example, and their mortality rates compared to here. And at that time, I was still comparatively an innocent abroad. And, I was actually open to the idea of a spreading respiratory pathogen, which I now know absolutely was not the case. So that,
So
as I
when you
say,
say you now know, what is it that you know now that
well, we have worldwide data now, and that you have people like I'm going to blank on his name now. I was reading a paper he wrote last night, who's a mathematician and epidemiologist. You have the work of Carl Hennigan, and even right back then, there were people looking at the data and saying there was, there was no in 2020. It's important. The one fact that people need to know is, in no country across this beautiful planet was there excess all-cause mortality in that year. None. In Ireland, the mortality, all-cause mortality, was lower than it had been over the average 3 years previously.
so less people died
Less
over
people
that
died
year
that
in
year.
total?
And interestingly, in a couple of years before, there'd been a very severe flu pandemic. So after a severe flu pandemic, a bad dose of flu, so that whenever you have excess mortality in one year, you expect the mortality to be slightly lower the next year. Because if you like, it's a horrible phrase, but the low-hanging fruit, the people who were, you know, the Grim Reaper was kind of waiting on, a lot of them succumb. And so therefore the next year you have a relatively healthier cohort of elderly people. So all of that, when you looked, and even factoring in all of those things, there was no pandemic. And you can see that this thing respected borders.
Yeah.
Different countries along their border lines had different mortality outcomes. And in New York, for example, we can now know, looking back, that certain hospitals, the excess mortality was confined to certain hospitals.
Yeah.
That's bizarre.
Yeah, were they reporting though? They were reporting numbers and saying like X amount of people died from COVID.
Yeah, but again, I was reading the Department of Health circulars about what was a COVID death. If you fell off a ladder and coughed, that was COVID. That's a fact. It's hard to believe, but if you had a cough and a temperature loss of taste and smell. There were 4 or 5 criteria. No matter what else was the matter with you, that was COVID. Seriously, you could not. It was
So
just
they were just putting it down if someone went into hospital with a different illness,
whatever.
or
Stage 4 cancer was, if you coughed, you were a COVID patient. You were moved to the COVID ward. And there were these, what I call death protocols. Now, again, did the people implementing these protocols? No, almost certainly not. I mean, they were using, as we now know again, agricultural doses of Midazolam. I think, was it the Minister for Health? What's the British boy? It was something like 100 times the usual use of Midazolam over those months, in 2020. And there was a peak in mortality in April of that year, which I contend is due to not only the protocols, but the neglect of the population. The ordinary medical care was utterly withdrawn.